All right, let's get a preview now of what we're expecting in the next couple of hours with Jacqui Heinrich. She's at the summit. Hey, Jacqui.
Hey, John, we have learned just now from a White House official some developments in what this afternoon is going to look like. The president was scheduled to have a one-on-one meeting with President Putin, and the White House is now saying it's going to be a 3-on-3. The president bringing along Secretary of State Marco Rubio and also Ambassador Steve Witkoff from the U.S. side. It's still unclear who might be joining President Putin on the Russian side, but following that meeting, there's going to be an expanded bilateral working lunch that will also include some other names. Rubio will be there. Secretary Hegseth is going to be there, Secretary of Defense. Also, Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and this Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. We know that the Russians brought along a huge delegation. It includes possibly hundreds of Russian businessmen who want to capitalize on whatever comes out of this and potentially seize on opportunities to strengthen economic ties and get around some of the sanctions that have been keeping Russia's economy down, looking to sort of enjoin the two economies and bring Russia back into the world economy. That might be out of the question if President Trump does not get what he wants out of this meeting, which is to be a ceasefire. He told reporters on Air Force One he's going to be very unhappy if he doesn't get one today. And he has repeatedly threatened severe consequences, including those secondary sanctions, if Russia does not negotiate toward a peace deal. He believes that it was the 50% tariffs on India that would have really crippled Russia's oil economy that brought Putin to the table. And he still has the potential to do that with China, the other big buyer of Russian oil, which would bring their economy from a place of bad to worse. On the other hand, he has touted the possibilities if Putin wants to do this right and come to the negotiating table earnestly and hash out a peace deal that's fair for Ukraine, the possibilities of joint economic partnership. Also, we know that Russia wants to talk about nuclear arms, and there was a comment from Putin released by the Kremlin yesterday that discussions about peace would only happen if there were controls over strategic offensive weapons, sort of a signal that they want to be talking about nuclear weapons, especially as Russia has been testing out its new nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered missile. So those are the things that are on deck. But of course, it's all going to hinge upon whether or not Putin is in the mood to truly talk about a peace deal and whether the president feels that it is genuine enough that a second meeting could be set up that would also include Ukrainian President Zelensky, where they can get to sort of the brass tacks on what peace would look like and what the U.S. role in that peace would be, including the possibility of security guarantees, which the president said are on the table this morning. So we are awaiting first images of the president as Air Force One has touched down here in Anchorage, Alaska, for this summit that the world is watching, John.
Jacqui, Aisha here. Before we get to the talks and the substance, people have been making a lot about the optics of this, and I want to get your take because I think there was I was reading about a tabloid in Russia that read, "So much for being isolated." And it's been very interesting because, some critics have been saying, well, this is exactly what Putin wanted. He wanted the image of standing next to the most powerful man in the world. What are you hearing on the ground there? How are Russians potentially framing this?
Well, it almost doesn't matter how the Russians are framing it. The belief from the White House is that President Trump doesn't need to do things the way that everybody else does it. He believes in his own negotiating prowess and his ability to really figure out at a moment's notice, he's said 2 minutes, whether or not someone is trying to hoodwink him. And you saw him directly also engage with the Iranians, gave them an opportunity to come to an agreement. They didn't do that, and he bombed the hell out of them and obliterated their nuclear program. The president has similar sticks in his arsenal that he could use to try to push Russia further back on its heels if things don't go the way that he wants. But he believes that if anyone is able to work this thing out, it's him, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen through the regular ways of diplomacy that every other president has employed.
So let me come back to what you said just a second ago, Jacqui, about Putin coming in with a whole list of demands that go well beyond the Ukraine war, such as strategic offensive weapons, nuclear arms, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that President Trump is going to give those desires and requests a whole lot of eartime, because he is there for one thing and one thing only, and that is to get a ceasefire in Ukraine and to try to set the stage for further meetings, the second meeting at the very least, to get Putin and Zelensky together to try to hammer out a peace deal. So I don't know that he's going to entertain all this other stuff that Putin wants to talk about.
Anyway, I'm going to keep going around.
Who knows if he will listen to it or stop the conversation, but what I am hearing is that they're aware that it might come up, and these are things that Russia wants to discuss, but the president's really focused on getting Russia to agree to a peace deal and getting them to earnestly engage in this process that Ukraine has been at the table for many months, and that the White House feels, Russia's been tapping President Trump along, and he's been very frustrated. You've heard him voice that frustration, saying that he's very disappointed in Putin, and he really believed that Putin would want to get this thing finished and move on to the next phase, and he has talked about the possibilities of what that would look like, but he has been somewhat bewildered at Putin's desire to continue this stalemate, basically, and continuing to put his economy in a tailspin because he wants to pursue all of Ukraine. And so whether or not there's a rational actor in Putin able to see the cost benefit of that is to be determined. The president obviously wants to figure that out for himself in this meeting. But he has also set up this sort of backdrop against which the U.S. is continuing to help Ukraine fight for its survival, selling weapons to NATO allies, strengthening the NATO alliance. The president has spoken very praisefully about sort of where the alliance stands now. And there was a fear heading into this administration from the last administration that President Trump would not want to be standing hand in hand with these alliances across the world. And really, he's done the opposite. He has made them more fair in his mind, strengthened them, certainly, and you hear that praise coming from Europe as well. This is not just the view of this White House. You hear it from leadership in the NATO ally countries in Europe as well. And including one official telling me this morning that if President Trump can get this done and can hash out a peace deal that's fair to Ukraine, they will be joining the list of names vouching for President Trump's nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah,
so
Hillary Clinton.
It's really been a different sort of landscape. Yes. Well, Hillary Clinton, but this was a senior European official as well, actually, who I was speaking to this morning, who's watching this summit very closely and believes that if anyone can get this done, it's President Trump. He's strengthened the NATO alliance. He has included a future for Ukraine that has arms continuing to come to them. And so we will see where he goes with that. But to finish your question, John, I'm not sure that President Trump cares much about those things if he doesn't get what he really wants out of Putin, which is a ceasefire.
I think we've all noticed, too, the talk about the consequences, Jackie. I feel like have been amped up over the last couple of days. Those economic sanctions, we know that Congress has been sitting on a big package, a bipartisan package for a while now, waiting for the wink and nod from the White House, which hasn't come just yet. Tell us about the president's mindset as we await to see him come out of Air Force One here and head into this bilateral meeting, about how prepared he is to hit Russia with economic sanctions.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to have to leave Jackie for now because we're going to be handing over to our colleagues Brett and Martha in just a couple of seconds. But on the point of Hillary Clinton nominating the president for the Nobel Peace Prize, I think she'd find a way to slip out of that,
Maybe.
even if he did get a peace agreement.
Somebody else would.
It's been great to be with you today.
You as well.
This is a very,
Big
very
day.
important day, and we'll see where the meeting goes. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm John Ross.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.